Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of News 24 Frontline. My name is Adriaan Basson, and I'm the editor-in-chief of News 24. Today's topic of discussion is titled Cops or Robbers? South Africa's Urgent Need for Criminal Justice Reform After Unrest SA. It's now been almost 2 weeks since the deadly 8 days of July, which has seen so far 337 South Africans lost their lives and tens of billions of businesses and value and jobs destroyed. No cabinet minister has been fired. The police chief hasn't once addressed the nation. The so-called instigators or kingpins haven't been arrested. And the ANC is still fighting about what to call what we saw unfold in real time. To help us make sense of this moment and look forward, we are joined today by some of the country's foremost experts on security and what we need to do to fix the brokenness of our criminal justice system. One of the major lessons for me from what we saw in July was that the security cluster was completely unaware, unprepared, and flat-footed for the terrible scenes we saw playing out in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng specifically. What did this moment teach us? And what is the urgent reform we need? We'll try to answer these questions in the next 90 minutes. Welcome specifically to our News 24 subscribers who are able to pose questions to my experts today. And can I ask you all please to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask a question with your name in it. We'll try and get to as many of those questions before the session is over. Let me introduce my guests with me today on News 24 Frontline. First up, we have Professor Jacob Mofokeng, the head of the Department of Safety and Security Management at the Tshwane University of Technology. Before joining TUT, Professor Mofokeng was a functional member of the SAPS Detective Service for 10 years. Welcome, Jacob. Then we have Dr. Jean Redpath, a senior researcher at the Dalla Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape, and the focus of her PhD thesis was on subnational government and policing in South Africa. Welcome, Jean. We also have Dr. Guy Lamb, who holds a PhD in criminology from the University of Cape Town. Guy is currently with the Political Science Department at the University of Stellenbosch. Before that, he was a Director of Safety and Violence Initiative at UCT. He was also a senior researcher, fellow and program head at the Institute for Security Study. Welcome, Guy, and thanks for joining us today. And lastly, we have Dr. Jakkie Cilliers, the founder and former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies. Jakkie serves as the chair of the ISS Board of Trustees and head of the African Futures and Innovation Program at the ISS. Welcome, Jakkie. I'm the only non-doctor in the room today, so I feel like a patient. But let's get started, colleagues. I would like to ask each of you to make some opening remarks. And I would like you to just say to our viewers and our readers today, if you look back at what happened 2 weeks ago in the country, what we now call the 8 days in July, how close are you to making sense in your mind about what exactly happened, what we saw unfold, and whether we can call it an insurrection or not? Much debate has been had over that term. We don't have to go into too much semantic debate today, but where are you in your mind as we sit here on the afternoon of the 29th of July about those 8 days, those 8 tragic days that unfolded specifically in KwaZulu-Natal? Jacob, if I can start with you.
Thank you very much, Adriaan, and good afternoon to your viewers and anyone who's on this platform. Indeed, what we witnessed, one can coin it as a house divided, and it has really brought some pains and open some old wounds in terms of the security cluster. The efficiency in terms of servicing the community and be able to protect the inhabitants, within South Africa. And, it is not a very small thing that we have lost over 340 lives. And we have lost, as well as what you have indicated, that tens of billions of rands because of inefficiency of law enforcement agencies in South Africa to be able to utilize an early warning system. And if one will be able to ask whether is this kind of incident the first of its kind in South Africa? Well, at a larger scale, of course, but there has been several incidents, that, started as the one that we have just witnessed now. And the question then we are asking ourselves is, are we still going to see these kinds of incidents in South Africa where we see a lackluster, approach as well as, reaction from law enforcement agencies? It's unfortunate that, we will always be reactive in terms aftermath of something like of this nature. And as I indicated that, it shows that, something is wrong, if one can really look into the finer details, that we are led by people that really do not take their jobs as well as the responsibilities seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Jean, if I can ask you to make some introductory remarks.
Thanks, Adrian. I think particularly what happened in KwaZulu-Natal has to be seen in historical context. And what we have in KwaZulu-Natal is an inheritance from 1994. The KwaZulu police were a strong force, and there were very great fears at the time that the KwaZulu police would become a force of their own. And that history has permeated KwaZulu-Natal policing since then. And so two interpretations are possible of what we saw in the last few days, 2 weeks ago. One of the legacies of that KwaZulu policing was a great degree of inadequacy in policing, particularly in the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, which are also densely populated. And that's an inheritance that is we've just maintained the policing that was received in the 80s. It's just retained the same levels. So there's an interpretation that says that this was due to inadequacy. The policing numbers in KwaZulu-Natal are proportionally much less than we see in the rest of the country. So there wasn't an adequacy. If you also look at all the indicators of policing performance, reaction times, visibility to the public, all of those are extremely low in KwaZulu-Natal. The only other province which is similarly low is the Eastern Cape. On the other hand, we also have a number of provincial commissions of inquiry that have shown that policing is politically compromised in the province. So two interpretations present themselves. One is that this is simply an indication of the inadequacy of policing. The other is that it was a deliberate failure to respond to the violence which occurred because of the compromise of elements within the national police. We know the national police have been compromised, particularly in crime intelligence, and we know that policing in the province is compromised. So those two interpretations could both be true, or either of them could be either way.
Jean, if I can push you a bit on that, do you think we'll ever know? Do you think we'll know which of those interpretations or a bit of both were correct? Is there any will that you see of anyone trying to uncover whether there were deliberate police inaction?
I think it's possible. I mean, the Morani Commission report in 2018 was very clear that the Provincial Commission into the political killings which took place in KwaZulu-Natal was very clear that policing in the province must be depoliticized. So we know that it is politicized, and we know that a commission, even a provincial commission, can expose that. So it's possible that if that is a large part of the answer, that something like that sort of commission would reveal that. So I think it is possible that we will know.
We've already seen calls for commissions of inquiry into these very dark days, and I'm sure that's something that the president will be considering. Guy Lamb, your introductory remarks after Jean told us about the historical perspective from KZN.
Thank you so much, Adriaan, and good afternoon to viewers. I just really want to kind of lead off from what Jacob and Jean said about, historical trajectories here, and I think it's already historical trajectories in terms of violence, because the violence is different. Certainly, we haven't seen the scale of looting. Certainly in democratic South Africa, I mean, we've seen isolated or kind of quite contained episodes of looting, but certainly we haven't seen it at this sort of level. We saw looting obviously during 2008, 2015, 2019, around xenophobia, for example, and xenophobic violence, but certainly not at these kind of levels. And it's not surprising that it happened in certain parts of KZN and parts of Gauteng, because also these were also parts of the country that were affected by very intense violence during the sort of political transition, early 1990s, right into the early 2000s. And then, of course, we saw them sites for significant violence in 2008 and 2015 in particular. So it really does expose that we have a problem with violence within South Africa, and that it's violence can be activated very quickly. And there seem to be forces, networks, and groups at play here that we don't quite understand. So we have some understanding of the police and we have some understanding of the instigators, but we don't really understand those that are making the violence happen, the kind of instrumental kind of approach to violence, the instrumental drivers of violence here. I think it's also exposed a number of crises, as has been mentioned by Jacob and Jean, not only within the police, but within the intelligence services. We've deployed the military, and already we're starting to see some, sort of like social media commentary about, are they fit enough to fight? It's exposing certain crises within the military as well. Fortunately, the military weren't deployed for too long, but there are crises within the military in terms of ability to provide protection and defense too. So it's really brought a number of factors to the fore, but also it has exposed, I think, some real challenges within the ruling party. And this is where it comes to the role of the term insurrection and why it's being used. And my take on it is that we still kind of don't have all the pieces of this puzzle together. We have bits and pieces, so we can get a fairly broad general picture of what's going on, but the nuance and the details not there. But it does seem to be a lot of this has to do with fights and battles within the ruling party, and the kind of push for the term insurrection is a way to describe and characterize this violence as undemocratic, as something that all South Africans should be against, rather than something, well, maybe this is about internal factional battles that spilled out beyond the ANC. So let me leave it at that. Happy to engage in other conversations throughout the rest of the webinar. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Guy, for bringing new issues to the table. Jakkie, your opening remarks.
Yes, I think Guy, in a sense, has nailed it, and that is that what we have experienced is the extent to which a factional battle within the ANC has become a national problem. And this is something that should concern all South Africans. It reflects, in a sense, the extent to which Jacob Zuma gave significant attention to the security cluster and instrumentalized the intelligence and packed both police, intelligence, to a lesser extent defense, with cadres loyal to him, mostly from within Umkhonto Sizwe, and the extent to which President Ramaphosa has not been focusing on that, but been focusing on economics, trying to get investment going at the various conferences, reform, and of course, setting the state free to eventually look at the issues of corruption. And I think that what has happened underlines the importance of stepping back and taking a comprehensive approach to who should be doing what. We are, without any doubt, given low levels of growth, inequality, high levels of unemployment, going to see recurring levels of violence and instability in South Africa. Those generally reoccur in the same locations. So not only did we see a complete failure of intelligence because it's been captured and instrumentalized in this factional battle, but we also see an absence of basic crime analysis, trend analysis. That's not rocket science. Our work at the Institute would indicate that 75% of the violence reoccurred in areas that have a long history of violence. So you don't need to be a rocket science to know where the violence is going to occur and going to reoccur. So what we need to do is really step back and say, we're going to be faced with this for many years to come. Let's orientate and let's give attention to the security cluster, and let's orientate the various components of this cluster to what the real challenges are that South Africa is going to face, because we will have to manage them. And I think that hopefully that penny has dropped, and that President Ramaphosa will start with reform. And that reform, of course, has to start at the top. It has to start in cabinet.
Thank you, Jakkie. Thank you, colleagues, for a fascinating introduction. I think you've put many of the issues on the table, and let's get right into it. Just to bring you up to speed, I've just received reports from my colleagues in KwaZulu-Natal that as we speak here, the police were trying to reclaim some of the stolen goods in a certain area in Durban and are currently under attack from the community. Who's preventing the police, the community is overpowering the police, too many community members trying to protect their looted goods. So this is still ongoing. We spoke about a commission of inquiry, but I mean, the violence is still ongoing. And this is, of course, one aspect of many of the things that we saw. Jacob Mofokeng, if I can come back to you. You spoke a lot about the SAPS. You were in the SAPS when I introduced you. I said you were a functioning member of SAPS, and I think I should have added of a functioning SAPS at the time. There seems to be agreement that the response of the police service, including crime intelligence, was woeful, slow, and unprepared. I had colleagues from News 24 journalists on the ground in KwaZulu-Natal and in Soweto who said that the looters were simply not scared of the police. The presence of police officers, police vehicles made absolutely no difference to people stealing TV sets and microwaves and other things from shops. What went wrong and what needs to change immediately? Is there something that can be done fast to prevent similar policing failures in the future?
Thank you, Adriaan. What happened actually is a self-imposed disaster. You know, we witnessed how, you know, people were looting, and you know, and we also saw some of the vehicles of police officers driving around, but they were actually outnumbered by community members. You know, one will ask then the question that is the leadership within South African Police Service functional? As my colleagues already alluded that, you know, the trends that happened, you know, we also witnessed such, you know, incidents in the past, and it will have been proper for the South African Police Service to identify that, you know, that particular trend will, you know, will repeat what happened in the past. So I will really feel for those operational police officers that were on the ground and being overwhelmed by the number of people that really wanted to have a stake, you know, to take part of, you know, the looting. Indeed, it shows that there is no communication or coordination between the police minister and the commissioner, as well as the crime intelligence divisional commissioner. And we read in the media recently, and that how then there's the strained relationship between the commissioner as well as the minister. So one will ask a question that probably they might have received the information, you know, regarding what's about to unfold, especially in Gauteng, but because of the tension between their offices and power tussles, and then here we are. Hence, I said then, you know, is the self-inflicted, you know, disaster that now affected so many areas. So, and yes, even though the government, you know, president acknowledged that, you know, they made a mistake, but actually the mistake started with those that are leading the police, that because of the power tussles between them, and then here we are, and we are talking about the aftermath of what happened in the country.
Jacob, the police commissioner has been completely absent in all of this, Kehla Sitole. He's not really even a well-known police commissioner, you know, to be frank. I mean, very few people really know who he is or what he looks like or what is his strategy or vision or plan. I mean, do you think that's a problem? It's very different from the likes of a Jakkie Cilliers or even others who came after him. Ria Piejo was very public, visible, and leading, you know, whether we can debate whether they were good or not, but at least visible and the face of the police.
Yes, it's so visible and clear that he's really playing from behind, and there might be a lot of factors that are at play, as well as one will argue that maybe then there is that tussle and the interference of the police minister into his activities, and hence now, if then you will have followed the developments that even if the police minister is making certain requirements in terms of the budget of the crime intelligence, then the minister will be really not in favor of such developments. And you see where you expected the commissioner to be, making speech in terms of certain operations, you see the minister. So as if now the minister has taken over the functions of the commissioner. So indeed, he's very silent, and that really brings a lot of questions on, to the fore, that actually, why is he so, not that effective?
I mean, the tension between the two of them is intense. We saw the Supreme Court of Appeal yesterday. You probably saw the judgment, where the Supreme Court of Appeal have now confirmed the judgment from the Gauteng High Court that Setole and others were in breach of their duties when they tried to stymie a IPID investigation into, amongst others, the buying of a grabber before the ANC's conference. And there's the ANC again, Guy and Jakkie, as you mentioned. So these things are intertwined. Certainly, Jakkie Cilliers, Jacob, still loves to lead from the front, as a former police general who was fired.
That's right. That's right. He missed that action.
Jean, if we can just stay on this topic of policing, you touched on the old KZN policing. I mean, what did you see there when you looked at what happened 2 weeks ago in terms of police action, inaction, the presence of Jakkie Cilliers, who's from KZN, but the absence of the police commissioner? Where does that lead you, and what's your biggest concerns?
I think what was most evident was the complete absence of the SAPS. We very seldom saw in footage South African Police Service. What we did see was Metro Police, traffic police, other forms of enforcement that were trying to get involved, some perhaps not in such a good light, but what was most clear was a complete absence. And I think, that in terms of that interpretation of SAPS being compromised and it perhaps being deliberate, this kind of deliberate withdrawal from engaging with the situation in order to give the faction enough growth to really do something really reprehensible enough for the country to agree that this must stop. However, we must be careful that that doesn't continue. I think targeting the poorest of the poor of the looters is a misstep, and it might be a deliberate misstep to further create division in the country. Because part of the intention here of the insurrection was to create division in the country, racial division, tribal division, division of the ANC, and it's ultimately targeted at the president, at getting the president weakened. And so any further missteps that we see from on the side of the police that continue from here up with the same leadership, the same people, has to be, a possible interpretation has to be that it's deliberate, and it's a deliberate mistake.
Jean, what is a solution for you, for lack of a better word? I mean, we saw, I don't know if you remember that it all happened so fast, but that day, I think it was the Wednesday when Jacob Zuma, the deadline for his arrest or for his incarceration, when the police had to incarcerate him or bring him to holding cells, we saw this massive deployment of national police officers from all over the country, from POPs units, from tactical units, via Mpangeni and Tshwane, and we saw this massive police presence in the country, which kind of created this like strongman, almost krachtdadige appearance to arrest Zuma, but literally 24 hours later, and definitely 48 hours later, the province exploded and you didn't see that presence of a national police task force on the ground. Do you have any idea why maybe not that happened?
Well, as I'm pointing out, it looks deliberate. It looks like there was a deliberate order not to engage. Perhaps there was a fear of a Marikana-like bloodshed, which would reflect badly on the government in power. But perhaps it was to, as I said, to have that faction really give enough rope to show exactly where they would take the country. There are a number of different plausible scenarios that fit with the evidence that we have at the moment. But the point is that, as you said, if they had sufficient intelligence, which it is claimed that there was knowledge that something was going to happen, there is sufficient capacity within SAPS to have deployed that, and that wasn't done. So either there wasn't the intelligence or there was a decision not to do that.
I think you make an excellent point about the chilling impact that something like Marikana could have had. And there's obviously a complex argument to that, because of course police shouldn't overreact, and of course caution should be exercised. But if you look at, I mean, some of those Marikana hearings are still ongoing in court. And I actually, when I referred earlier to my colleagues who reported from the scenes of the crime, that they were told by the community members that they are not scared of the police. I now remember one journalist telling me that a looter told him, we know the police can't shoot us anyway because they'll get into trouble. How should the police address this? I mean, I'm not sure what scares me most: a police force that's still loyal to Jacob Zuma, or at least sections of it that may be loyal to Jacob Zuma, or a police force that's unwilling and almost paralyzed to do their job.
So there's a very big difference between tactical policing and public order policing. And one of the big mistakes that was made over the last decade, more than a decade, say 15 years, was a reduction in the capacity of public order policing. Our public order policing is actually very good. These are people who are psychometrically tested, they are calm under pressure, they're well-trained, they're able to contain a situation. But we have fewer than 10,000 of them in the whole country. So you would have needed to put your whole capacity there. Tactical people are not for that scenario, and that's what was deployed at Marikana. So the problem was we need to expand our public order capacity. The SAPS has already made metro police be the first responders in public order scenarios, so they're required to turn up and contain the situation because they don't have sufficient of their own capacity. But metro are not allowed to engage until SAPS is on the scene. So SAPS never arrives on the scene, then it never happens. There's no engagement. So we do have the knowledge and the know-how, and we know how to do public order policing in a way that doesn't end in the Marikana. We just don't currently have the numbers of people to have been able to do that in the situation. But didn't necessarily require that throughout the country. A couple of well-placed roadblocks might have done the trick. You don't necessarily need to be shooting people. SAPS is very good at roadblocks. I don't think there was a single one that I'm aware of that could have stopped cars from driving to do the movement. So it is indeed a puzzle.
Guy Lamb, before we go into, I have a question for you about communities, but before we go there, I mean, would you like to come in on the issue of possible reasons for why the police may have been caught flat-footed, you know, whether it was deliberate, whether it could be a chilling impact from Marikana?
I mean, I think there are potentially multiple explanations here, and we're still gathering the intelligence. I agree with pretty much most of what Gina said, particularly around the public order aspect. There's, you know, the public order personnel and distribution throughout South Africa is based on a kind of a threat analysis, and you know, it's based on an assumption that they're going to be these sporadic service delivery protests or labor strikes, and then you allocate your resources here, there, and everywhere. And of course, if you had good intelligence, and I think this is the one thing, and crime intelligence have admitted it themselves, is that the intelligence just wasn't there, it wasn't good enough. I mean, despite for anyone who was watching the situation, knew there was going to be violence, knew there was going to be unrest, as kind of one key issue. But I want to sort of just also jump into your question you asked about, sort of police and not being trusted and respected within communities. And this is really what this violence has exposed, as well as a sort of breakdown in relations between communities and police, and low levels of police legitimacy, low levels of trust between the community and the police. And there's an excellent book written by Johnny Steinberger a number of years ago called Thin Blue. And it's a thin book, but it really speaks to this point about police go into areas, particularly poorer areas, townships, informal settlements, and they have to negotiate access. And if they want to get compliance in many of these places, they have to show up in numbers. And that's why the police often make use of their high density operation model, which is when they kind of go in large numbers and overwhelm and saturate areas, often bring the military in with them to provide kind of perimeter support, additional numbers to do this. And that's just really an indication of the poor relationship between the police and community members. And I think that will probably lead into what you want to ask me about communities. And I think, what we saw recently in KwaZulu-Natal in particular around how communities responded.
Yes, I posted a link to Johnny's book in the chat room for those subscribers who would like to get the book. But please continue, Guy. I mean, we saw, I think, an extraordinary reaction from communities on a spectrum from very good to very bad. So we had communities feeling completely abandoned by the police in Durban. I spoke to some of those people. I mean, they were deeply traumatized people. They were kids, teenage boys who were manning the streets, with kind of ammunition. And then you had, on the other hand, what I think we can safely call vigilantism now, where specifically in a neighborhood like Phoenix, there seems to have been an extreme reaction from a very angry community that spilled over and exposed racial fault lines and historic fault lines in that community. How do we take lessons? I know this is very fresh, but I mean, from what you've seen, express a view on what you've seen, and what does this tell us about community policing, community involvement in safeguarding their communities?
Well, I think certainly the recent unrest and insurrection that happened in places really did expose how poor the relationship is between SAPS and various communities, and in many places. In some places it was good. So certainly on the positive side, we saw communities coming together, where we've seen in the past where there's been sort of resilience and prevention of this type of violence happening, particularly around xenophobia, is when there's been a good relationship between the management of the local police station, the ward councillors, non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, and the community policing forum. And usually where those relationships are good and there's quite strong cohesion and, sort of norms about trying to prevent violence, that you don't see these kind of things happening. And this is what we saw happening in some places, where you saw kind of communities coming together, protecting, community assets, kind of looking for ways to try and diffuse the situation. But then you had the other extremes, where we had vigilantism. And it really underscored a point that Jean made. It was like, where was SAPS? And in these kind of situations, I think in a place like Phoenix, I think big questions need to be asked about the SAPS management in that particular policing precinct and cluster, because SAPS should have been playing a role there and sort of working with community groups and how do we make this area safer, how do we respond to it. But it seems as though SAPS were completely absent. So you had the sort of stronger pro-violent voices taking the lead, and as a result, you're seeing vigilante violence as an outcome of that. The sort of sense of just, well, government's not here to protect us, so we're taking the law into our own hands. When other places you saw, obviously, community groups being activated, where you had fairly functional community policing forums and mobilization around just visibility. But in places where there was, quite a lot of tension, you saw this form of vigilante violence happening. And it really did expose that the relationship between many communities and the police is so poor that communities don't trust the police, and hence we will take responsibility for our own safety and we will choose the ways we want to pursue that.
Jakkie Cilliers, I want to come to your piece now that you wrote last week, your very good piece, if I may say so. But I first want to just talk about this issue of labeling, the term insurrection. I mean, where do you stand on the scale of violence, looting, insurrection, insurgency, and why is it important?
Well, I actually don't think it's that important, because you get into the labeling and so on. But there was clearly a degree of organization behind this that spilt into the reaction that we saw. So however you want to label it, this was a deliberate attempt at furthering the infighting within the ANC and taking that to a new level. The response within South Africa demonstrates the challenges that lies ahead. And those challenges can only over the long term be dealt with through real inclusive growth, and growth in the formal sector, employment in the formal sector. That's going to take time. So we have a tinderbox, and we have to manage this tinderbox. So in the piece, Adriaan, that you graciously refer to, I speak about this. Firstly, the point that President Ramaphosa needs to really take the security sector seriously. He needs to engage in it. He needs to clean it out of the political appointments that have been made. He's already unlocked, if I can call it that way, the NPA. There needs to be structural, deep reform of the security sector. We need to orientate the police and decentralize it, and flatten, it's got over 200 generals and I don't know what else, decentralize it to metropolitan and provincial level, the execution, keeping procurement and all of that kind of stuff centrally, really empower detectives, invest in crime trends analysis and all of those kind of things, while maintaining centralized control over standards and reinvigorating forensics and all of these kind of things. It's basic management. It's not, but it requires capable people at the top. So that is the biggest challenge. Let's stop with cadre deployment. Let's take professionals that have gone through the ranks and appoint them to manage the police and orientate it and do the things that John and Guy have talked about. And then we need to reorientate the military towards the real tasks that face South Africa. And there I, quite controversially, so I'm aware of this, I'm saying we need to focus on getting the military to be an emergency response force. When there's dwang in the Vaal River, we deploy the military to come and deal with it. When there is problems with COVID, we deploy the military to try and help that. Let's acknowledge those roles and prepare them and train them to play a useful role, for example, in support of the police internally and on border security, and to prepare for peacekeeping. All this conventional defense stuff is nice. We don't have the money, and you can do most of that by internal reform with a bit of additional money for the military. But and then intelligence, well, that's a whole, South Africa is blind when it comes to what's happening in the region. Think of Cabo Delgado and think of Eswatini. So we blunder along with our security forces. Let's step back, get our security architecture right, and that's not a complicated exercise. Get rid of this fanciful notion of a border management authority, which is just new potential for cadre deployment, and focus our security agencies on the real tasks at hand, structure and fund them for that. And that can probably be done within the existing financial envelope. There's no more money that's going to go to them. But we face ongoing challenges in the years ahead. We need to prepare for that. South Africa is not in a crisis, but we need to manage insecurity in the years that lie ahead.
Jakkie, that was a lot. I'm going to try and unpack it. I've just also posted a link to all our attendees and viewers. I've posted a link to Jakkie's very good article on criminal justice reform. The government should really just take his article and implement it, I think. But anyway, I don't know why that hasn't happened. I've posted a link to that in the chat box for those who want to read it. Jakkie, I've just seen a push alert from News 24, of course, that President Ramaphosa this afternoon on a COVID-19 vaccination PR stunt, let's call it what it is, said that we must watch this space on cabinet reshuffle.
Oh, good.
The issue of reconfiguring cabinet is an ongoing consideration for any president. I know that everyone is talking about this thing called a reshuffle. He said he was applying his mind and that we should watch this space. Now, I have learned to temper my expectations with President Ramaphosa and not get too excited that means tonight there's going to be a family meeting. But let's just talk about the security cluster ministers and whether you think we should, or he at least should begin cleaning up there. because how important are they really? How important is a police minister or a minister of intelligence when you have organizations with directors general who suppose, and like you said, almost 200 generals in the case of the SAPS, that's supposed to run these organizations, to run strategy, to run budget, and make sure they work. I guess there's an argument to be made for almost no political interference, and then you have someone like Jakkie Cilliers who is almost acting as a police commissioner.
Well, he's doing that because he has an ongoing fight and difference with the police commissioner, who now I think is on his way out. So we'll have our 10th or 11th national police commissioner. It's hugely important to bring stability, professional stability, into the top security echelons. Whether that is possible within state security, nobody knows, because it's a black hole. Nobody knows what's going in there. All that we know is that it certainly is not living up to its stated mandate. And I mean, there are so many examples. If we go back to what was presented at the Zondo Commission of money being carried to pay Jacob Zuma and I don't know whom else, Dr. Mufamadi, Sydney Mufamadi recommendations go back to December 2018. And there have been talk and so on and so forth, but the chickens really came to roost, I think. So we also have a National Security Council that started operation in 2019. What are they doing? If this is not a call for real reform within cabinet, but also for bringing capable, competent, which can't be political appointments, people to manage each of the various departments, then nothing is this simply must happen. We are going to sit with this challenge going forward, and not only here, but as we have referred to previously in the region. We want to tell every other people how to help them in Cabo Delgado and so on and so forth. We really face serious challenges going in the country, and that requires competence at the highest level. Only while we've got to manage this while we get the economy going.
Jakkie, I argued on Monday in my column that I think Ramaphosa is quite weak on his security strategy. He's not a security man, and unlike Zuma, he didn't immediately bring in people that he could trust into those positions. There is an argument to be made that the ANC doesn't really have so many people to choose from the ranks of MPs to replace the likes of Jakkie Cilliers, Ayanda Dlodlo, Nosiviwe Mapisa, Ngakula. Where do you go if you're the president? I mean, you're limited.
Well, you go outside of the top leadership of the ANC. All three, the members of parliament you've mentioned, members of parliament, ministers that you've mentioned, have not been up to the task. And I have quite a bit of sympathy with the challenges that they face, but none of them have been able to reform their departments. One of the reasons is that the previous president appointed the director generals, heads of departments. So the incoming minister is faced with a challenge. We have to resolve that. And for example, one of the things that needs to happen within the Department of Defense is the Defense Secretariat needs to really be rethought, as well as the role and functions of the Police Secretariat. There are many of my colleagues on this panel that will probably disagree with me on that. But this is not rocket science. We just need to sit down, decide where we want to go in terms of our security architecture, and keep that as simple as possible, and then train and equip for that function. The police, the military, for example, are completely helpless when it comes to support of the police. So they can arrive there, but they can't do anything, and the people know that. So with a military man standing there, he's got an R4 with sharp ammunition. Everybody knows he can't shoot. They're too unfit to chase people down in any case, So it's really an institutional challenge that, for example, the Minister of Defense has been going along from the white paper on defense that Rolf Meyer and his colleagues did 2015, which is just a completely useless document in terms of setting any kind of realistic vision for the Department of Defense. So we can take all of these, let's decide where to go. Needs a relatively small meeting of experts that decide and maps this out, sets this out to South Africans to comment on, and let's implement them. But bringing quality people into the top leadership, both in the political level and at the senior official level, is absolutely critical. Without that, this will not happen.
I see your colleague Gareth Newham had written a response to your article. I don't know why he hasn't yet pitched it to News 24, but he has posted a link in the chat room for everyone to see. Gareth, thank you so much. We will make sure to get it onto our website soon. We will read that. I haven't had the time to read it, but I would be interested to see your views as well. Thank you, Gareth. Jacob Mofokeng, want to come back to you and specifically now talk about intelligence, or the lack of intelligence, unintelligence. Who is to blame? Who is to blame? Was it SSA? We saw the Minister of Intelligence, Ayanda Dlodo, saying in recent days, no, there were intelligence products, as they call reports. I don't know why they call it products, but they call it products because you know, there was a lot on social media. They picked up in May, in June already about what may happen if Jacob Zuma is jailed, and they did give these reports. Jakkie Cilliers says, no, you didn't give it to me. I would have known if you gave it to me. And then she says, no, we gave it to the police because, you know, we don't give it to the minister, we give it to the organization. I mean, where are you standing, Jacob Mofokeng, on the role the SSA should have played, the role crime intelligence should have played, and what both did or didn't do?
Thank you, Adriaan. Before I answer your question, I wish to go back to the subs missing in action in those areas such as KZN. And well, if you look at the NDP, the National Development Plan 2030, then you know the purpose for that piece of document to be drafted, you know, it was with an attempt to eliminate poverty and reducing the inequality within our society, and also to bring into line the performance of government departments such as the South African Police Service, and whereby it is expected that the subs should work with other, you know, structures within the communities. And their act of missing in action, that in itself, then it brings the question whether, you know, is it not politics so infested within South African Police Service? And it's my view that really they should be taken to task. You know, it cannot just be an apology. Then they owe the public, you know, an explanation that why, you know, was the South African Police Service not, well, actually they were missing in action. Coming to your question then, as you rightly put that, you know, we were informed that the State Security Agency provided with regular briefings to the South African Police Service, including the intelligence. But then the question is, why then was there such an incident where the police could not plan and deploy an adequate number? You see that we read that, you know, in Jabulani Mall at the time of this incident happened, there were around only 10 police officers that were deployed. So, and you find that even the acting commissioner of intelligence, you know, at some point she did indicate that she was backing, you know, for reports in terms of analysis of the threats and in terms of, you know, the latest developments. And then with a clear instruction that, you know, every day by 11 a.m., then she would need to be provided with information, and nothing came forth. So then the question then will be, you know, are there any groupings then within crime intelligence, as well as, you know, within South African Police Service, where, you know, it depends where you are seen to belong to, that if you offer instruction then to the people that you are working with, then if then those people then they side with either the minister or the commissioner, then we will see the report forthcoming. So I will say that for now, it is not really clear where the blame should be leveled at, because the SAA, the South African Security Agency, actually says that, you know, they did their part in terms of providing adequate information to the South African police, probably, you know, the crime intelligence. But then why then the information was not disseminated then to on the operational level? So it is, it's something that, of course, then we also need to be informed, as a public that, who dropped the ball in terms of that particular incident of not communicating and deploying. As I indicated that, the squabble between the minister and the commissioner, it brings a lot of bottlenecking in terms of the performance of the South African police. So we see that how, currently now that crime intelligence cannot make use of informants because, the commissioner has not yet approved the budget because of his disagreement with the commissioner. And you also look at how
the minister, yes.
Yes, then you also look at how if the commissioner appoints a particular person, then the minister will suspend that particular person. And, it shows that there's such power, struggle within, South African Police Service. And then there might be where the problem lies, that even though they were provided with information, as we already discussed, that we see the inaction of the police commissioner that then is being overruled, if one might say, by the minister. Probably you might have said that, okay, then because this person is always overstepping my boundaries, let us see then how this situation will unfold. So unfortunately, then we can see that, probably then the South African Police Service then dropped the ball on taking what as a recipient of the information provided to them.
Jean, I want to turn to some of the questions from our viewers. So Brian Jackson is asking, there was an obvious lack of riot equipment by the police, shields, body protection, tear gas. The police fired rubber bullets randomly instead of using tear gas, which would have been more effective. Why this totally inadequate equipping? Can you take that one, Jean?
Yes, so as I said earlier, the main problem has been the down resourcing of the public order policing over the last 10 to 15 years. And a lot of the responsibility of policing land invasions, policing public protests, the first response has been shifted onto municipalities. So whether that be metro police or other forms of law enforcement which municipalities have, even in small towns, that responsibility has been shifted down. Many such towns don't have the resources to equip their people with armadillo suits and the like, so then it doesn't happen at all. So what we're likely to see happening is more towns and municipalities, metros, taking up more and more of the responsibility for those kinds of things, which SAPS has actually just, in a way, refused to take on. In particular, land invasions. They, unless it's going to get violent, they will not participate in policing that sort of thing. So it's a policy decision. It's a reduction in the public order policing component, which requires greater training. It requires lots of equipment if you're going to do it properly. And it is more resource and more expensive than an ordinary police person. So yeah, there was an absence of that, and there should not have been an absence of that. And it's been pretty obvious, at least for the last 10 years, that we needed to further capacitate our public order policing.
Jean, I want to stay with you for just a second and talk about this very difficult topic of policing poverty and policing unemployment, and you mentioned land as well, because those issues are very topical still in South Africa. We still have major issues with unemployment and joblessness, specifically after COVID-19, and also now what happened 2 weeks ago. What is your view on that? I mean, as we speak here, I just received another report that there's now shooting going on in Durban of police trying to regain those stolen goods. I mean, of course, the police would argue, well, that is their job. If someone steals something from a shop, they should go and get that thief who stole the goods, But there's obviously a much more complicated history and background to South Africa's socio-economic conditions. I'd like to hear your view on that.
So as Jakkie pointed out, the only way out of this conundrum is inclusive growth. And in the interim, we need the rule of law and we need law and order to the extent that we can. And it doesn't help if police are without a warrant barging into people's shacks and not following the rule of law. They become part of the problem. That's not following the rule of law. And also in a country with limited resources, we would hope that the police would prioritize the ringleaders, the cause, the root cause, and not the poorest of the poor who possibly didn't steal a flat screen TV but happened to not have receipts for the bags of flour. So it's those kinds of issues which are going to cause a great deal of further problems and disunity in our country and fracture the country. There really needs to be proper prioritization of the right people, and it's something that one sees across the African continent. As governments lose power, they start to lose real power. They start to over-police the poor, and the rich get away with whatever they need to get away with. And it's a way of keeping the populace under control, especially when resources for policing become less and less. And so, yeah, it is a deep problem. We need to have rule of law. We need to have law and order. We need to have human rights respected, and that is all possible with the right political will.
Guy Lamb, there's a very good question here from Michael Apple, which I would like you to respond to. I'm just going to read it out. Good afternoon. Was the labeling of this as an insurrection by President Ramaphosa merely a politically convenient way of deflecting from the notion that infighting within his party could be responsible for the unrest? In any functioning democracy, an incident that caused 340 plus deaths would result in mass resignations and removal from office. Should we not hold our collective breaths that state leadership will be held to account instead of some DJ being invested as being labeled as the instigator?
Yeah, I mean, so let me just quickly follow up on what Jean said about, kind of policing of the poor. I mean, the motto that the police have been following over the past few years, which is in their strategic plan, is stamp the authority of the state, which really in very clear terms is kind of an instruction to the police. And it was an instruction certainly from the police minister around, you have to go and demonstrate power and demonstrate the use of force and demonstrate who's in charge. But it kind of falls flat if you don't have the numbers. And also it leads to these kind of things of breaking down doors and human rights violations and kind of people getting injured and some people getting killed. So yeah, the police have been poor, the poor have been policed to a similar way, poor people, black people were policed under apartheid, and there's many similarities there. And then the question about, the use of the term insurrection, and, the point here is we're still trying to figure out exactly what the objectives of this violence was. I mean, it's clearly had to do with, kind of certain factions within the African National Congress. But if it was a true insurrection, there would have been, sort of attacks on certain government infrastructure, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, maybe of, kind of seizing control of the provincial legislature, kind of radio stations, kind of setting up liberated zones. You have armed militias who are able to kind of attack the police stations being attacked. Those sort of things didn't happen. But I think ultimately there were some insurrectionist intent. But the use of the term insurrection is very much to demonstrate that this is, to try and say that this is an attack on South Africa, not necessarily an attack on parts of the ANC or the ANC who are in power. So it's about to try and say that this is, all of us need to come together to address this particular issue in it. And I think what it is possibly an attempt to deflect away from the dirty dealings and the problems that the ANC is having and sort of the broken house and the internal battles that are happening within the ANC. And it's an attempt to say that we need to marshal government resources to deal with this. Whereas not necessarily the ANC needs to be dealing with many of these issues as well. So I think the kind of term has been used for very specific political reasons.
I guess it partly depends on whom you think is in control of the KwaZulu legislature. Is that the Zuma faction or the Ramaphosa faction? So an attack on the provincial government, would that have been scoring an own goal? It's a snide remark, but I think there's a degree of validity in that question.
Guy, just quickly, there's some questions from Kate Alexander. which I'd like you to take. The first is that I think Kate says the Marikana analogy is inappropriate. The massacre was well planned by SAPS, probably with government support. And then there is also another one. Sorry, I'm not sure which one Kate refers to here, but let's just talk about Marikana and whether that's an inappropriate analogy.
I mean, Marikana was about a labor strike, you know, in Northwest Province and the Platinum Belt. It had mine workers who went on an unprotected strike. It had to do with, you know, some tensions within the ruling party. It had to do with, obviously, rival, you know, trade unions being established. But that ultimately came down to, you know, the SAPS is completely inappropriate and problematic way in which they dealt with that particular crowd situation. I think what happened in Marikana may have influenced the thinking around how the police responded to what happened in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng recently. But, you know, these are two, you know, very different episodes in South African history. You know, Marikana, very, you know, kind of well-defined conflict, very well-defined incident, whereas what happened in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng was you saw violence springing up in so many different areas, and it's certainly the News 24 map of the unrest shows that. So there's so many different conflicts connected to a larger conflict, but they had, you know, various drivers behind them. So I think making these kind of comparisons between Marikana and what happened recently is that I don't think is appropriate.
Thanks for that. Guy referred to the map that we have compiled, also with the friendly help of the ISS and Jakkie and his clever colleagues. If you go to the chat button on your screen, viewers, you will see a link to that map that shows you exactly each town or place where there were violent unrest. And my colleague Azara Karim, who compiled this for us, told me this morning that we are now on 204 locations of violent unrest flare-ups. In particularly KwaZulu-Natal. If you look at the KwaZulu-Natal map, it's like a thick, uninterrupted red stroke from northern KZN, specifically then that Tongaat, Kwaduguza area right into the south coast. Jakkie, I want to come back to intelligence. So in your piece, you made reference to the appointment of Neil Barnard, who was a political scientist at the University of the Free State, if I'm not mistaken, before P.W. Botha appointed him as head of what became the NIA, which was then the NIS. Why are you advancing the appointment of an academic or an outsider who doesn't understand the ANC's history, who wasn't in Umkhonto we Sizwe? If you look at the previous DGs in that agency, you know, people like Barry Gilder and Billy Masetla and Mo Sheikh, they were all very much from the ANC intelligence background, where Jacob Zuma was, of course, a main figure. I mean, do you think it's at all feasible to bring in someone completely outside of that crowd? Yes,
I think it's entirely feasible. Umkhonto we Sizwe was a very small organization, and deeply politicized, and it has become deeply problematic in South Africa. In other countries, you can think of Zimbabwe, Namibia, where there was a real liberation struggle fought. The so-called war veterans became a hugely destabilizing force subsequently. South Africa had a different history. MK was, the armed struggle in South Africa was symbolic more than anything else. You had a very small armed wing, but they deeply, deeply politicized and trained in the Soviet Union, East Germany, and so on. Very different to the mainstream of the ANC. The mainstream of the ANC, and I had engagement with both of these factions, is really, in my view, a deeply ethical, morally based organization. But those exiles are mostly retired, stepped down. The MK vets, very politicized, they were all appointed, particularly by Jacob Zuma, into the security establishment. And Ramaphosa has paid no attention to that. And he's paying a price for that now. So there's nobody within the ANC he can really bring out, because MK guys belong to the Zuma faction, those that aren't too old. So he has to look elsewhere. And there are many, many competent South Africans that can be brought in to reconfigure. Now, what P.W. Botha did was that you had the Bureau of State Security and Hendrik van der Berg and all of these kind of things, who really were involved in all kinds of despicable illegal and other activities. And he brought Neil Barnard in, a conservative academic from University of the Orange Free State, and he created an organization that gained quite a reputation as ethically bound and with good analysis and so on. And I think that where we are at a point where we need to really wipe the slate clean, I think. Remember that through the State Security Agency, Zuma established an entire parallel security establishment and network to help him in his factional struggle within the ANC. You're not going to unravel that with the same people. I think it really is time that we step back and take a different approach. And I don't know whom but there are many capable and competent intelligence people that I think could be handed this, I wouldn't say poison chalice, but that can take South Africa forward. Without intelligence and without crime analysis, you are blind, and that is where we are.
Jakkie, just on what has played out in the past 2 weeks ago, and well, still ongoing. I mean, isn't there also a case to be made that you didn't need this super duper massive intelligence infiltration? People were literally tweeting, if Jacob Zuma goes to prison, we're going to cause a word that I'm not going to say on air. And I mean, it wasn't that difficult to figure out that,
exactly.
I'm not a policing expert, but you have to deploy, you have to do preemptive stuff.
Exactly.
Roadblocks around KZN.
So the basic things are not working. And this is your basic crime analysis. I want to repeat the point. Our analysis at the Institute indicates that 75% of the locations where violence happened are well-known spots. All that you need is a bit of memory to realize this is where it's going to recur, and this is what's happening again. This doesn't require intelligence, but our crime analysis capacity has also been completely whittled away. We don't, because we have a highly centralized and over-promoted police, which is sort of the shape of a mushroom. And what we need to invert the mushroom, so that the deployment and the actual activities, the actual operational and activity of policing is decentralized to provincial and metro level, and that your standards setting and your budgetary control and oversight and stuff, that's still, and your quality control, that happens. You don't need 200 generals to be able to do that. So the problems are largely problems of management, rather than they are of, we need to clean out intelligence, we need to sort that out. We need to refocus the military on their true roles and functions and equip and train them for that, so they are not helpless. Because at the moment, for example, with regard to the military, we're expecting them to do things that they are neither equipped, trained, or that they have the staffing for. It's a lack of focus. I started off by making the argument that Ramaphosa really needs to focus on the security cluster in his own interest, in South Africa's interest. And the appointments there must be able to survive the end of the Ramaphosa presidency. This is not the place where you appoint people from your faction. You bring in people that get a reputation that means that they are not politically involved. Else you end up in this factional kind of issues.
Your expectations of politicians are very high, Jakkie. I remember a story. I remember now vividly again when you mentioned the parallel unit from the SSA headed by one Thulani Dlomo. I remember I think it was around 2013, I was working at City Press, and Jacques Poe was working with us. And he one day came up to Ferriel and myself and said that he's got a major story about a rogue unit operating in the SSA. And he was, of course, talking about this special operations unit that was headed by Thulani Dlomo, who is this obscure character brought in by Jacob Zuma himself from KZN Social Development, where he was up for corruption, to become a Deputy Director General, I think, for counterintelligence in the SSA. And Jacques wrote a story, and it was a City Press lead, but on the same Sunday, the Sunday Times published a rogue unit story about SARS. And it turned out later that this was indeed one of the SOU's projects, was to smear SARS and to call that the rogue unit. So the real rogue unit was always Tlhomo and the SSA. And I mean, he managed to build a unit with hundreds of millions of rands. We heard that evidence from Sydney Mufamadi in front of Judge Zondo, employed officers or intelligence agents who were off the books, who probably still working for him in KZN, and had a whole fleet of vehicles that the SSA hasn't managed to find yet. So, I mean, that scares me to think that there's a complete parallel structure that may still be active and operating.
Well, cutting off the money is where this should start. So getting control of the financial flows is the most important. This is not only a political enterprise, but it is also an organized criminal, lucrative enterprise for people to make money out of political factionalism. And at the moment, the Auditor General seems to be unable to get his hands on what's happening with the money. So there are legitimate reasons why within the security agencies you can't perhaps always do normal accounting, but then you establish a strong internal accounting capacity that has got security clearance and so on and so forth. So stop the money and get control of the money. And President Zuma really, President Ramaphosa really needs to focus on that in his interest and in South Africa's interest.
And Jakkie Cilliers is withholding the money from intelligence because he doesn't like the appointments Sithole has made. Jacob Mofokeng, I want to address this question from Peter Leon to you. Peter, thanks for joining us today. It's nice to know that you're listening. Question from Peter: isn't the whole South African policing model wrong? South Africa is one of the few countries in the world outside of France where with a totally centralized police service outside the metro police departments, which has limited powers. To fix the problem
what is currently happening with the current model, then it has to be revisited, and I think that it is important that we have to look at digitalization and sharing of resources, because most of the time, like what Jakkie indicated, that the model or the structure of the South African Police Service is heavy top, and as such, money then goes to salaries of those that are at the executive levels, and then fewer resources, and also lack of progression for those that are on the operational level. So the model then has to be revisited. Then it needs to be aligned in terms of the realities of South Africa, and as currently, then it's not effective, it's not working, and many people then they are disadvantaged in terms of the service delivery, because even on a yearly basis, when Treasury is allocating budgets, then the money is not really adequate for the South African Police Service because of skewed model. Thank you.
Jakkie?
Adriaan, thanks. Yes, I don't think you require any constitutional amendment. To the police is centralized and it's very top heavy, and but within the current constitutional framework, you can reform the police. You can do everything that is required. Just push some of the execution capacity down to metros and provinces, and keep some of your key services, your standards and control of money, keep that centralized. But I think we need a complete reversal of thinking. Previously, this was stymied when the DA won control over Western Cape. This was a political issue. ANC didn't want to decentralize policing because the Western Cape would then prove that they can do a better job or whatever. And in actual fact, what the national government did under Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma is they tried to starve the Western Cape of appropriate policing and other things. I think that debate has shifted now. The ANC, with the next elections, quite probably will lose Gauteng. Well, as the majority party, we'll see what kind of coalition is then put together. But I think the argument about the importance of prioritizing peace and security, safety and security, the evidence is just clear. You need to push your policing closer down to where the challenges are. And I think you need to parallel that with restructuring the military, that they can provide policing support at metro and provincial level. I'm not talking about that the military become paramilitary. I'm not suggesting that, but simply that they are trained and equipped to be able to support when there is a crisis. when the police cannot deal with the situation. And then there's all the other reform that we've talked about in terms of detective services, training, the public order policing, and all of these things. It can all be done within the existing budget. The police get $200 billion a year. Military get about 43 billion, which is probably too little. But you don't. You need a modest shift in the defense budget to be able to reorientate them to provide that, plus area, because we also need to deal with area protection, both by the police and the military, and border security. Just getting away with, for example, the Border Management Agency and some of the superfluous departments that have been established within defense, such as Veterans Affairs, would already relieve significant amounts of money.
Jean?
Yeah, so when what Jakkie is talking about is decentralizing a national police force, which is bringing it down to a lower level. But I think what the question was referring to is, where does the political accountability go to? So the political accountability would still be national, and even in a decentralized framework. So the other possibilities of a model is where the political accountability is to capable provinces and municipalities. And we have the scenario, a model in Canada where there's a federal police service which provides services to provinces and municipalities, but provinces and municipalities who want to run their own can do so. So they actually contract with the national service to do that. And that's a possible model that South Africa can go. And in a sense, that is what's happening in reality. We already have around 36,000 people employed by municipalities in law enforcement type roles. That's slightly more than a third of the people who are at police stations in the SAPs with their inverted structure where they don't have sufficient people at the lower level. That's a significant increase in resources that is already happening because of the need, because SAPS is not doing its job. So if SAPS doesn't do the job that Jakkie has outlined of decentralizing, that trend is likely to continue, and the shift of security power may well happen. President Ramaphosa needs to make these changes, not just for this country and for his own political faction, but for the ANC. I've done an analysis of, there is a correlation between a worsening murder trend and a drop in the number of votes the ANC gets, the percentage of votes. And I've calculated that if in 5 years the murder rate worsens by 8 per 100,000, they will drop below 50%. That's a 93% correlation. That's very clear. Worsening murder rate, drop in ANC support. You don't normally find that when you do analysis because people tend to look at areas and the high crime rates tend to be ANC supporting areas. But when you look at a national level and you look at worsening rates, that's what we see. So if things worsen and we go back to the kind of murder rates that we saw in 2003 to 2004, if that relationship continues to hold, the ANC will drop below 50% in national elections.
You heard it here first. Guy Lamb, I want you to take the next one and also talk a bit about what you saw from private security and just private security in general. So Kate Alexander again is asking, could one of the experts comment on the use of private security, both employed by shops and shopping malls and those working with community defense groups in KZN, I guess? I'm still wondering who the people were who were killed. Were they looters, security guards, police officers? If you can just respond to specifically what we saw now, but just in general, again, about the numbers of private security versus the state. The last time I saw it was many times higher.
Yeah, and thanks. Good question. Thanks, Kate, for another good question. In terms of the numbers, I mean, the sort of the ballpark figure that we use is about 500,000, but I mean, that's not all operational people. That includes locksmiths and those who work in the security sector. So it's not all people you see driving around in private security vehicles. I think in terms of the role of private security in these contexts can be very controversial and they can exacerbate situations. So for example, during the Fees Must Fall protests, Roads Must Fall protests a few years ago on university campuses, private security organizations, companies were at the forefront of a lot of this unrest, and in many cases, their interventions exacerbated situations. We saw people getting hurt as a result of that because private security companies, most are not trained to deal with crowd situations or deal with looting situations. You do get specialized companies that do this, but certainly in KZN, these were, armed response type of companies. These were neighborhood patrolling types of organizations, and you saw, who tend to recruit individuals who, kind of have quite a militaristic mindset, and then in these situations under pressure will respond in the ways that we saw happening in places like Phoenix. So in many cases, private security individuals overstepped the mark and did not obey the law and contributed to violence happening as a result of their actions. But in other cases, we did see private security contributing to improving safety in certain areas, being able to kind of mobilize people to engage in kind of visible policing. But in some cases, we saw private security involved in vigilante acts. And I've seen from reports that are out there in terms of who died, I mean, it seems as though it's not clear if they were looters, but, ordinary people, citizens who died as a result of these kind of actions. We did see reports of those who are police, either SAPs or kind of municipal metropolitan police dying during these kind of incidences. But it did seem that there were kind of citizens that died. Whether what they were doing at that particular point in time, we don't know. But we do know that some were kind of had petrol. They were doused in petrol and set alight, which is sort of a kind of a hallmark of quite a lot of vigilante acts within South Africa. And if private security played a role in that, it's highly problematic.
There were a few tragic incidents of children who were basically just curious to see what was going on the East Rand and in Pietermaritzburg. And they were caught in crossfire. And I remember the one little boy, I think he was 14, in Pietermaritzburg, was killed by a police rubber bullet. We just had a report now actually in that a woman has died this afternoon in Lamontville in shooting between cops and gunmen when the police went to retrieve stolen goods in KZN this afternoon, and she was a bystander. That is the information we have at the moment. So I guess that's a type of scenario you referred to. Jakkie, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, I wanted to first just make a point. Hans Bieler in the comment section made this argument that we really need to work towards a common approach towards the re-establishment of the rule of law across South Africa, and that's very important. I think we have a culture of lack of accountability, and I half-jokingly only said ANC stands for absolutely no consequences. And unfortunately, that's where it has to start, because this crisis has its origins within the ANC. The second point relates to private security generally. So I do sort of big picture kind of analysis, and the facts are simply that the South African state increasingly has to rely on the private sector to build, because it doesn't have the capacity. So I think a partnership with the private security sector is going to evolve, whether we want it or not. And that is going to evolve, that the private security sector is going to police, look after security in the richer middle-class neighborhoods and where there are high-value assets, and that increasingly the police will probably be required to be deployed and look after security in the poorer communities. This is not ideal. This is, but that's how it's going to happen. And if that is the case, we should plan and prepare for that, because it's not something that we can control. This is market forces that are going to drive this. How exactly we do that, I am unsure, but it is something that I think we have to look towards a system where all the security capacities in the country are to some degree coordinated or managed in a way that they complement and help one another. But of course, the primacy of the state remains. I'm not undermining that at all, but I'm sort of just making the point about where the realities are. Where I stay, I hardly ever see a policeman or woman. I see private security.
Thanks for that, Jakkie. I'm going to read Hans's full comment because I think it's very good and helpful. And then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make a closing remark. So if you can just start to think about your closing remarks and take us forward into what should be done, assuming that the president is listening to us at this moment. Hans Buehler, thank you very much, Hans, from the Hans Seidel Foundation, writes, maybe it would be strategically clever to place the idea of building trust between police and citizens in the center. This starts with fighting crime professional in line with rule of law. This means professional leadership, well-recruited officers, and transparent promotion strategies. In theory, this also contributes to increased trust in the government and in the state. It will also contribute to better human development if safety is improved. Should it therefore not be a major objective of every political decision maker to work towards the rule of law and to strengthen and professionalize the necessary instruments? Maybe this is a way to package it. Indeed, well packaged, Hans, and thank you for that contribution. Jacob Mofokeng, closing remarks from you.
Well, I will close by saying that probably what we are talking about then will become clearer, as time passes and more information will become available, to the bear to understand actually what happened. And it's very much important that, our leaders, those that are in the security cluster, should have foreseen the gravity of what we're about to unfold and pave a way in terms of how do we go forward, in terms of really bringing confidence and trust. Because currently now, trust is an issue, because then we realize that then there's no capacity, for those that are leading us to be able to detect the warning, systems or warning signs in terms of what might happen. So going forward, then it has to really look at the appointment of future people that will be able to lead these powerful institutions that, is very much important that the organization is bigger than the individual. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Jean?
I would agree with the idea of we need new leadership. We need capable people. Somebody like Zwandile Petros, who used to be provincial commissioner in the Western Cape of Gauteng, really excellent policeman. Contract came to an end in 2012. That was it. But that's not going to be enough, because you have an institutional culture that has been destroyed, that is corrupt, that is inadequate. We need to have a functioning discipline system within SAPS. We need to have proper rank promotion examinations. We need to get rid of all the deadwood people who are causing a problem in SAPS. We need to empower IPID to better able to get rid of the bad eggs. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's not going to be simple. It's not going to be easy.
Thank you, Jean. Guy Lam.
Sure, I agree with the previous two comments, but also just to kind of bring in something else as we focus on the police, on the intelligence services, on the military, private security. I mean, I think it's to go and look back at the white paper on safety and security, which is a 2016 piece of policy, and there's been a lot of work done around it, and more recently a whole implementation strategy has been devised. And I think this is something important looking forward, because it argues for a very difficult thing, which is a whole of government response to the problem, and that's what we need. I mean, there were comments about the economy and need to do something about growth and employment, but it's around there other issues here, human settlements, housing, social development. And I think that all sits within that policy document. And it actually makes this implementation strategy actually makes provision for the presidency to play quite an important role and to set up a violence and crime prevention center within the presidency. And of course, with COVID, that got put on hold. But the whole of government approach can be very helpful. And certainly the Western Cape government is trying it. They've got this whole safety plan. It's been a bit undermined by lockdown and COVID, but certainly I think we need to move towards that if we want to try and prevent this kind of violence from happening further on, and also lead to building trust between citizens and government again. So thank you.
Thank you, Guy. And Jakkie, last with you.
Thanks very much, Adriaan, and for a fascinating conversation. So the President established the National Security Council in 2019. And I think that what is required is that National Security Council needs to take a look at the about 180 billion rand that South Africa spends every year on security, and tailor that money to our actual problems, needs, and so on. We've talked about the need to decentralize the police and to bring it closer to the people. We've talked about the need to reorientate the Department of Defense to actual roles and functions and so on. Home Affairs should be moved from, by the way, the security cluster into the economics cluster. It's not a security function, but it performs a very important security clusters. And then we've spoken at length about the, 4-5 billion rand that goes into the State Security Agency. There are many competent, highly qualified policemen, women, defense and intelligence people in South Africa. They have been grossly undermined by political infighting and by cadre deployment and bringing in lateral deployments. All that we need to do is to promote those men and women who really can take South Africa forward and give them the responsibility and simplify things for them. We have created tremendously onerous systems, mostly through the to try and combat corruption, the Public Financial Security Management Act, whatever, the name now escapes me. But we need to move towards a system of accountability management, holding people to account, rather than trying to have tick box exercises around which corrupt cadres try and work. So lots of work to be done, but we don't need years of investigation to do that. Much of this is in actual fact quite common sense.
Common sense. Thank you, Jakkie Cilliers. If I was a president, I would appoint all 4 of you to fix this for me. Let's see if you will take our advice. Thank you so much for your contributions, Jakkie, Guy, Jean, and Jacob. I'm looking forward to seeing you again on News 24 Frontline and also in our opinion pages to which you regularly contribute. Thank you to our viewers and our readers who followed this episode of Frontline. I certainly have learned much this afternoon. If you are not a News 24 subscriber yet, please support us. Only 75 rand a month to grow our investigative journalism and to make it possible for us to investigate stories like these going forward and for you to ask questions to my clever guests I had today. Thank you so much for your time and see you again at the next Frontline. Goodbye.